Okay, everyone, welcome to the video on Samsara, the cycle of existence, if you will, or the wheel of existence. This is the last real foundational conceptual idea of Hinduism we're going to lay down that makes up the core of all these ideas we've studied so far, from Brahmanatman to Maya to Dharma, the divine order, to karma, the cause and effect of morality within that order, and now Samsara. And perhaps pun intended, they're all connected, right? There's a connection between all of them. But I say this is the last major conceptual, kind of going back to the idea of metaphysics from the first lecture on philosophy. This is the last core metaphysical principle of samsara that does have moral implications. And after this, the question is going to really be, because as you'll see at the end of this video, really the fundamental goal, if there is one, of Hinduism, the Vedanta tradition, is moksha, which in Buddhism they call enlightenment or awakening. Buddha was literally the enlightened one. And after that, the question is, how the hell do we do that? How do we reach enlightenment? What is enlightenment? What's it feel like? What's it look like? What's moksha look like? And so I'm going to address those questions a bit in this video later on. But the point is that the next couple videos before we start reading the Bhagavad Gita and deepen our understanding of these ideas, the next couple videos are going to be on yoga. And yoga, you keep hearing me say this, another term that is used in the West in a way that is a much deeper, in my opinion, is much deeper in the Hindu tradition. So we'll talk about what yoga really means and the different ways that yoga has been used. It does include body work, like you'll see in a yoga studio, but as you'll see, it's not quite the same as that. Okay, so that being said, let's talk a little bit more about causation and this idea of interconnectedness, just to get us into samsara, the cycle of life, because it's all connected to this idea of reincarnation, which again is something else I'm sure you've heard about. And so one thing to point out is that the idea of causation, and I tried to elaborate this a bit in the last video. It's not as clear-cut and simple as it seems. Good people always, bad people don't always get bad things happening to them right away and so forth. And in fact, in Buddhism, they deepen this idea by talking about mutual causation or mutual arising causes. Meaning that, in other words, instead of seeing the universe as this domino of causes since the Big Bang or God or whatever, Buddhists kind of see independent causes leading to one cause that is itself the cause of something else, right? It's this deep web of causation. For instance, if we were to talk about the causation of your birth, many of us would say, well, your parents conceived and that was the event. I mean, is it that simple though? Right? There had to be all these microcelled organisms that evolved into what your parents were, and all these different things that didn't happen that could have happened, and all these different mutually arising causes that really lead to each event. And then your birth isn't one singular event that just causes one other thing like dominoes, that you have an influence on one person and not on this person. And you get the idea. It all goes back to Dharma, the divine order, and the karma working within it. Okay, so that's kind of important background to understanding samsara as I work towards it. The other thing is that when we think of when we think of reincarnation in the West, it's yet another thing where our thoughts about it aren't entirely wrong, but they're also not as deep as they could be. So sometimes you hear people talking about, well, actually, in this case, they're sort of wrong. Here's what I mean. Sometimes when you hear people in the West talking about reincarnation, they'll talk about a past life, right? There's even psychologists and psychics, not often accepted by Western science, who will read into your past life and say, you lived the life of a young prince boy in the 1700s or something, or, you were a princess at one time. And, people kind of look at this as an ego boosting thing, like, oh, that's so cool. In a past life, I was this. And maybe you have a dream that makes you think of a past life. I'm not trying to poo-poo that. What I'm saying is that's not at all what Hindus mean when they talk about reincarnation. And let me just put it straightforwardly. You don't want to reincarnate in Hinduism. The goal is to stop reincarnating. And samsara, the cycle of life, refers to the cycle of what they call rebirths, of going from one existence to another, and then just continuing around and around in a circle. it's not a good thing from the Hindu perspective. You want to stop doing that. You want to stop reincarnating. Reincarnating means you have not yet realized your true nature. And again, what do I keep saying? It goes back to Brahman Atman. You have not really truly realized your true nature as Brahman, as, you haven't realized God as him or her themselves yet. You're still stuck in the ego cycle of samsara and reincarnation, and it's pulling you away from that realization. And from some perspectives, it can go on for thousands and thousands and thousands of rebirths until you have the realization you need to come to an awakening and realize the Brahman that you truly are deep down. In Buddhism, as we'll talk about later, they sometimes divide, this happens in Hinduism too, but Buddhism in particular, certain strands of Buddhism divide reincarnation and realms of rebirth into different specific realms. So for instance, there's the realm of the animals. There's the realm of, I think there's one called hungry ghosts. And those are where people reincarnate who were prideful and greedy, and they wanted a lot. So now they're destined to walk around in this life, in this reincarnation, as people with huge stomachs and small mouths, so they can never fulfill their needs. And all of this is driven by karma. The way you behaved in the previous life influences your reincarnation into the next life. Right? Some Buddhist and Hindu traditions have the concept of hell. But unlike hell as an eternal suffering for not, having said yes to Jesus or Muhammad or whoever, as you see in the West, hell in the Eastern tradition is a temporary stage, a temporary rebirth that, let's say you're a murderer or a vile murderer, you will go through in order to then come around and have another chance at reincarnation. Another chance at another life, but really another chance at awakening. Right? So again, to repeat, you don't want to reincarnate. Right? You don't want to have a past or future life. From the perspective of Hinduism, from the Vedanta tradition, you want to stop reincarnating. And so that is samsara, the wheel of existence. Right? We truly are, from the Hindu perspective, again, we are God, but it's so seductive. The Maya, the false reality, the veil of illusion that's been created for us, it's so seductive that we can't stop pulling into it. We can't stop pulling ourselves into the Maya. We can't stop pulling ourselves back into the ego existence, to an existence of what life can get for me, what I can gain. And that's the condition of existence, right? Because again, you go back to the idea of, well, if we're all God anyway, we're all this great Brahman, why is it so hard to realize? Well, again, it's nobody's fault. It's just the nature of the way the Prakriti unfolds. It's the nature of the way Maya veils us, and then it's our own egoistic desires that pull us back. Now, in some traditions, in both Hindu and Buddhist, you'll see the idea that only humans are capable of being enlightened or awakened or reaching moksha, this liberation from the cycle of life. And that goes back to the idea that from the perspective of the Hindu, humans are the only truly consciously self-aware beings, so they're the only ones that can do it. And you get closer and closer with each rebirth, theoretically, although it's possible to fall back. And just to kind of connect this back to the historical roots of the idea, just a reminder, this has changed now, but a reminder going back to the caste system and how it began in the Vedic period and was realized in the Vedic period, again from chapters 1 and 2 of the textbook. In Indian history, the Vedic period, the caste system was very rigid. And so the idea of samsara, the cycle of life and reincarnation, was that, and karma as well, was that you deserved to be at the place you were in the caste, so to speak, deserved, in the sense that that was your karma based on the previous past lives that had been there. So if you were at the mid-level of the caste system, the idea was, well, you still have a lot of ways to go to reach that moksha or enlightenment. You haven't at least reached the level of a Brahmin, who, remember, is a priest caste. But at the same time, you're not at the lower level of the caste. You've made some advancement. So there's this idea of karma and dharma, the condition and sustenance of existence, all bound up in one's cycle of life and where they were. And again, sadly, in that time, this gave people a justification for mistreating the Dalits, the people who were seen as the outcasts, who weren't even good enough to be part of the system. But all of this, again, I'm connecting back to the concept of samsara. So this is where the concept originates, is in that old early caste system where, if you were a really, really bad person, you would reincarnate as a cockroach or a scorpion or something that humans reviled, right? If you still did really bad things and you weren't quite as bad, then you'd be a Dalit. You'd be the lowest level of human. So reincarnation and samsara had different levels in humanity. Now, again, as we'll talk about, the Buddha tried to dissolve this, arguing that this was an old-fashioned way of looking at this concept of samsara and reincarnation. But it's important to think about the origins just to understand the trajectory of it. And so, again, the idea is that every rebirth brings us a little bit closer to liberation from ego, liberation from the connection to the wheel of suffering and Maya, the wheel of suffering that includes depression, that includes desires, that includes things ending and people dying, and it includes happiness, but temporary happiness. All relationships end. All people are going to die, right? And it's that whole cycle that keeps going on. Why do we stick to it? Why don't we realize our true nature more easily? My favorite metaphor here is that it's because ego is like mud, right? It's like mud sticking to you. You can't get it off of you. And think about this in your own life, in our own lives, how there are things that we know are wrong. I don't even mean deeply morally wrong, but I mean, that could be that too. But I mean, there are things we know that are wrong that are not good for us, but they kind of like pull us in. We can't escape them. Whether it's playing, 10 hours of an online Call of Duty video game. Don't get me wrong, I love video games, but there's a difference between attaching to something and doing it for fun because you want to, right? Maybe it's a sex addiction. Maybe it's addiction to gambling, right? There's things that we kind of know we're doing that make us feel good in the moment, but we know it's not good for us in the end, but we can't stop, right? The ego, the pull of the ego, whatever it might be. Maybe it's relationships. You're in a bunch of bad relationships. You always go back to the same kind of person. And you always think at the beginning everything's going to be kittens and butterflies, and all your friends tell you don't do it. It's the same thing. And lo and behold, 6 months later, you're angry at the person and you break up and then you start again, right? We have these cycles of ego. So I'll repeat the metaphor again. We don't realize our true nature and stop reincarnating in the cycle of samsara because the ego's like mud. It sticks to us, and the more we do it, the more we want to get into it. And so in Hinduism, that's the idea, is the reason why it takes most of us cycles and cycles of rebirths to reincarnate is because of the pull of ego. And theoretically, each time you get a little bit closer. Each rebirth, you get a little bit closer. You get a little bit pulled back from it. And there's sort of an interesting consequence here where, again, this is all if you're looking at the world through the eyes of a Hindu, which is what I'm trying to help you do. Have you ever noticed how sometimes there are certain people you meet that maybe regardless of their age, they just seem a little bit more connected and grounded in life, a little bit more unperturbable, a little bit more harmonious with their environment, maybe not necessarily trying to control or direct people or lecture people. They just kind of serve as a sort of a fountain or source of wisdom. And sometimes people like hanging around these people just because of that sense they have. On the other hand, there are people that are much more clearly, often of their own admission, much more clearly ego-oriented. They want something from you. You know that they're selfish. You know they'll steal from you if they're given a chance. From the perspective of a Hindu, these are people who, on their cycle of rebirths, one is closer to enlightenment or moksha, and the other is less close. And I think you can guess which one is which. And so the idea is the closer and closer you get, the closer you get to moksha, the closer you get to this enlightenment sense. And so let me talk a little bit about what that would be. What is it that happens when you become enlightened? Well, metaphorically, I've been using the metaphors of waters and ponds and rivers and lakes and so forth. And I think it's very helpful. As long as we remember the principle that words are a map, going back to the first lecture on Hinduism, Words are a map, they're not a perfect guide. But some would say it's kind of like a raindrop. A raindrop that through the process of nature gets sucked up into the cloud. And this is our lives, right? This is our lives are like the raindrop. And if you're going through the cycle of life, you're continuing to stay up in the cloud. You don't realize that really you came from the ocean. And the process of enlightenment or moksha, liberation from that cycle, is like the raindrop falling back into the water and realizing I am Brahman. Right? Again, it all goes back to Brahman. I truly am this broader ocean of life. What does it look like more specifically? Well, a person who's reached this level, first of all, is no longer going to reincarnate. Like I said, the purpose is to stop. They will live the rest of their life generally in bliss. They may still engage with people. Some people who are said to be enlightened or have reached moksha don't engage. They meditate for the rest of their lives, often in a cave, 10, 12 hours a day because they're in such a state of bliss. They don't need anything else. Other people engage in teaching, trying to help other people out of compassion, reach where they are. One of in the former positions is a guy named Ramana Maharshi, who is somebody who supposedly reached this moksha, the stage of liberation from the cycle, when he was about 15, 16 years old. And he spent much of his life in the same area in India. And people would come to talk to him, and he wouldn't really say much. And it became known as the silent teaching. He taught people just by his presence. Because like I was saying before, some people have a presence that just gives off this higher level of wisdom and understanding. And Ramana Maharshi would spend hours, like I said, hours and hours a day just meditating. He didn't need to do anything to achieve anything because he was no longer bound by the pull of ego. So moksha is releasing the mud of the ego, right? It's getting the mud completely off you, taking a clean shower in the Brahman and never coming out, realizing that this mud of ego is just going to bring you down. It might feel good in the moment to have that sex, to gamble, to do something that spurs your ego. But in the end, it's going to pull you further and further away and get you muddier and muddier with the stink of ego. And so the metaphor of reaching moksha or enlightenment is removing the mud and stopping the reincarnation. Right? So that person theoretically is taken out of samsara when they die, and they merely reintegrate with the universe. They fall back into the ocean. The raindrop reintegrates into the ocean. And so, there's other things we can look at. A person who's reached enlightenment is certainly not going to be knowingly deeply cruel to anybody else. They'll generally be extremely empathetic and compassionate. They will put others' needs above their own because they have reached beyond those needs. It doesn't mean they won't, be strong. If somebody mistreats them, they will respond back at that level. Right? It doesn't mean you're weak or you're a doormat, to use the modern phrase. But it does mean that you see the struggle and you see the ego in other people, and you feel not just pity, but you feel compassion and empathy. You want to help them escape it the way you've escaped it, because there's this bliss that is Brahman Atman that you've reached from the Hindu perspective that you want other to reach. And another way to say it is there's a deep love of everything with no attachment. Going back to the analogy of a relationship, it's not love as attachment where you need the person and you start crying if they're not around. I know that's putting it a little crudely, but there are many relationships built on attachment where people might even be saying I love you to that person, but it's not really a deep, full love of that person's being and a concern for them, a compassion for them. So the truly enlightened person who's reached moksha and stopped reincarnating is one who feels true, deep love without any expectation. I'm not loving you so I'll get something from you. I'm not loving you because I want you to love me. I'm loving you because I genuinely feel deep love for you that can't be stifled or contained, right, is the idea. And there's a word drawing from the Sanskrit that kind of characterizes this state, Sat Chit Ananda. And you'll see this in the book as well. Sat Chit Ananda. And what this means is boundless being, consciousness, and bliss. Right? So boundless, endless being, existence is boundless. You've realized your true nature as Brahman Atman. Your consciousness is free. You're no longer confined to a singular consciousness. You realize that that's all just Maya. You realize you're truly part of the ocean, right? The ocean that is Brahman. And then bliss goes back to everything I was just saying about love, which entails compassion and true concern for other people. And so, again, I would point back to how if you observe the way people behave and you're thinking like a Hindu, you can see some people are closer to this state and some people are further away. And of course, the teachers and masters that Hindus and people of the Vedanta tradition want to learn from are people who have demonstrated this level, this lack of cruelty and true compassion and love for others. And so it's also realizing that, going back to the concept of play, Lila from a previous lecture, it's also realizing that while your ego isn't truly what you thought it was, it still exists as Maya, and it's still fun to play the role, right? So you'll often see people who are said to be enlightened spiritual masters in this tradition, like I said before, very joyous. They have fun, they make jokes, they joke about their lives, they joke about things, because when you reach that level of bliss, it's just happiness that remains, right? All you want to do is, I think of kids jumping in a field, having fun, playing together and laughing. And I've heard some analogies that enlightenment is going back to what it's like to be a kid when you're like 3 or 4 and you have no attachments yet and you haven't learned about the cruelties of the world. It's like that state of mind, except you're an adult, right? It's like shrugging off, going back to the onion metaphor. You've peeled off all the layers of the bullshit onion that were given to you throughout your upbringing, all the layers of personality, right? All the nonsense you learned, all the ideologies. It's shrugging that off and going back to what it was like to be a kid, right? That's the idea. And then one last thing I wanted to mention here is that in Hinduism, there really isn't a sense of converting other people to believe what they believe, right? There isn't going door to door and saying, hey, can I teach you the good word about God? Because it's not necessary. Hindus tend to see other people, they're on the path that they're on. Like, of course, an enlightened person is going to help in the way that they can. But if you see, it's the same way you see a 3rd or 4th grader, you're not going to try to teach them super advanced calculus yet, right? Any more than you teach a dog calculus. You're not going to try to teach them the deep nature of the Socratic method or some philosophical concept that takes years to understand. They're at that level. And that they just need to be at that level and go play, watch Harry Potter or read Harry Potter or whatever. It's a similar way with an enlightened person, or in Hinduism, even somebody who's more advanced, and they see somebody who's clearly stuck in ego. First of all, they have the idea that I'm not going to be able to help them anyway. What I say is probably going to piss them off. If I try to say, hey, you're stuck in ego, it's going to engender a defensive reaction. But then secondly, there's a sense of acceptance and the idea of impermanence, that I accept where they are, and I accept that the universe will give them what they need in whatever course of rebirth they're in to eventually reach moksha, right? That their state is not permanent. They will move on. Maybe they'll grow and have their own spiritual experience, but it's not necessarily my place to directly guide them or tell them what they should be doing, right? So there's a deep sense of the idea, there's this phrase that some spiritual teachers, the way they put it is, there's a sense that we're all going to go home eventually. It's like seeing somebody out on the street who's wet and cold in the rain, and yeah, you could go and help them, but the idea is they're going to reach home. They're on their way. They're still walking. It's a little rougher for them, but they're going to reach home anyway. So I wanted to end this section with that part of samsara, that the person who has realized their true nature as Brahman, extracted themselves from the cycle of samsara, and they see others who are still clearly immersed in that cycle and the mud of ego is all over them. There's a sense of, well, you let them be and you let them come to samsara, come to moksha and get out of samsara on their own terms. Right? And so there's a real sense of acceptance and love and compassion in that sense as well. Okay, so next time we're going to talk about yoga and how to do this, right? That's the last thing we haven't touched yet. Like I said at the start of the video, how do you make this out? How do you reach enlightenment? Well, there's an entire series of books, one called the Yoga Sutra. There's thousands of years of tradition of yoga that includes meditation and body work and all sorts of stuff that is guided towards getting yourself out of the cycle of samsara.